Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I got to see one of my oldest pals this weekend. That's oldest as in the person I've known longest, not, well, he's around my age, we'll put it that way. He lives maybe half an hour away, 40 minutes, but it's the first time we've seen each other in 2 years, pandemic and everything else. Beyond that whole situation, we both had some pretty big life changes this year, and it was awfully good to sit down and just gab about the little stuff and the big stuff for a couple of hours. Plus, we got a little hike in on the Lenape Trail, so it was like old times for us, except, now with the specter of death. But no need for a downer just now. You guys deserve a fun conversation. This episode, well, this is a really entertaining talk this week. My guest is Jacques Berlinerblau, who is a professor at Georgetown and author of the brand new book, The Philip Roth We Don't Know: Sex, Race, and Autobiography. It's from University of Virginia Press, comes out today, which is September 14th, 2021, for you time travelers out there. This is a fascinating book. I enjoyed the living hell out of it. It explores Roth's life through the 30-odd novels he published, along with his short fiction. And in the conversation, Jacques going to describe and justify the process of reverse biography that he engaged in. But his approach is to dismiss Roth's claims that none of his books are autobiographical, and to look at the life threads that are there and build a life not just of Roth as a person, but as a writer, and what it means to do this as a fictional project of oneself. Now, along the way, this isn't just Roth biography. He gets into some of the major trends throughout Philip Roth's work, particularly the aforementioned subtitle of the book, Sex and Race. He also manages to uncover some deeper themes in Roth's work, ones that may reveal more than Roth intended them to do. And Jacques explores those topics throughout the entire body of Roth's work, and really brings the receipts, as it were. Now, in keeping with the reverse biography method, Jacques also gets into the question in the book of how much or whether Roth should be implicated or condemned in the Me Too era. That is, given that there have been no public accusations of Roth's behavior with women, but some pretty harrowing / questionable renditions of relationships in his fiction, is it fair or justified to tar him with the same brush as Harvey Weinstein, Louis C.K., Bill Cosby, and guys like that? It's a tough question. It's not a tough question. I mean, he has not been accused of anything like that, but the book and this conversation go into the question of whether Roth's work will survive as we get into that new era with the changing perspectives of readers. Young literary readers have different expectations and tolerances than they did 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And I'm fascinated to see how reputation changes, especially literary reputation. So Jacques' book explores that, and our conversation goes even further into that because he's been teaching Roth to readers for so many years and seeing how the readers are changing in their response and approach to him. So with the Philip Roth We Don't Know, Jacques tackles all of this in an engaging and familiar voice with lots of worthwhile citations from Roth and his critics, and the expertise of someone who's been reading and teaching this work for decades. Now, as I mentioned at one point also, the main text of this book is like 130 pages. So it's a pretty devourable piece of work if you're into the subject matter. I enjoyed the heck out of it, so I hope you check out the Philip Roth We Don't Know, which comes out today from UVA Press. Now, here's Jacques' bio from the book. Jacques Berlinerblau is Rabbi Harold White Professor of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University and author of Campus Confidential, How College Works, or Doesn't, for Professors, Parents, and Students. His new book is The Philip Roth We Don't Know, Sex, Race, and Autobiography. There's a much more extensive bio at Jacques' website, and I'll give you the link to that at the end of the episode. But now, it's time for the Virtual Memories conversation with Jacques Berlinerblau. Just as a basic opening question, and trust me, I have all sorts of other weird ones, tell me about the origins of the book. Where did the Philip Roth We Don't Know begin for you?
Wow, it's such a good question, Gil.
And we'll go into your whole history with Roth.
Sure.
You know, I'm sure that's going to be integral to this, but you know, we'll talk about that too.
Sure. I had been teaching Roth strangely since the 90s. Maybe
is it strange that you were teaching him, or you were teaching him in a strange way?
No, it's just strange that every year, no matter what department or college I was teaching in, I'd somehow end up teaching a Roth course or a Jewish American Lit course or a course just on him. He'd always find his way into my syllabus. Even I was a comp lit professor. I was a sociology professor. I was where else? Religious studies. I was in all these different departments, and I kept teaching Roth or being asked to teach Roth. And I guess what started me moving forward on an actual research project was the sense that my students were changing across that 30-year arc.
And that's exactly one of my other questions. I'm so glad we're getting to this early then. Yeah.
Yeah. The types of enthusiasm they used to have for him in the 90s, they had a little less of that enthusiasm for him in the aughts. And by the last decade, they were in a state of out-and-out insurrection. And I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah. We'll tackle that part of it because I do want to get into what it's like teaching him, and then what, you know, how students' responses to him have changed and why you think that's the case. But first, you know, the nature of this particular book, you characterize it as reverse biography, and you know, I'll talk about it in the introduction, but if you can talk about the principles of that in terms of what it meant for this book and this particular author, what does reverse biography entail, and how did it work out for this one?
Great. Reverse biography is the one thing as a professor of literature you're not supposed to do, and it's what we tell our students never to do. Never read a character in a work of fiction as an expression of the actual author of that work of fiction. It's sort of like literature 101, and it's a great and sound principle, except it doesn't work with Philip Milton Roth. And he exploited our hesitancy to break that rule as a means of creating his art. And I find this to be very fascinating and very complicated, especially since critics across the way would say, hey, I think you're writing autobiography, Mr. Roth, and he would just shut them down. He would be, you don't understand what literature is. You don't know how to read fiction. That's nonsense. It has nothing to do with me. It's all the imagination, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I had to put an official stop to it. I certainly wasn't the first, but I wanted to write a book in which I showed that his claims to the contrary were groundless. And reverse biography would be a way of looking at fiction where you look to the fiction and then ask as a hypothesis, did this actually happen in the author's life. And my conclusion with this particular writer was, more often than not, the answer is yes, and we can no longer be afraid to say that as professors of literature.
Is there another writer you can think of who this would so apply to? Or is Roth sort of the unique situation here?
No, I mean,
with such a body of work, I mean, other people, yeah, they're going to interweave biographical facts into their fiction, but
sure. Adam Begley, in his biography of Updike, made a similar claim. He wasn't talking about reverse biography, but he said a lot of what was appearing in Updike's work was autobiographical. I think what's different about Roth, and sure, every writer incorporates autobiographical elements. What's different about Roth is the wink and the nod and the game. He's signaling to us in his fiction, for reasons I've never fully understood, that he's writing about events and people that he knows or are very close to him, or occurrences that happen to him, all to then deny it. It's this funny 3-card Monte game. And nobody else engaged in that gamesmanship with the reader and with the critical apparatus around the study of literature. And that's what makes Roth interesting. Like, why did he need to play that game? Why was he constantly denying, decade after decade, the autobiographical components of his work? We can talk, Gil, about autofiction as a genre, which is not autobiography, and that's probably a better way of referring to what Roth was doing. But there's a Venn diagram between autobiography and autofiction, and there is overlap. And Roth, who's a master of autofiction, clearly incorporated many autobiographical elements into his 28 novels.
Speaking of, you went through the entirety of Roth's body of work for this, including some of the short fiction. And I assume research assistants help too in terms of, figuring out, references to X, Y, and Z, how often certain things occurred within it. How long a project was that? Because very recently I've thought of reading his work backwards from Nemesis on. I just finished The Humbling last night. So, I just idly thinking I could pick up Indignation after this, but,
Well, I wouldn't advise this as a project for anyone else. The truth was, I had read all of Roth by 2010, 2012 many times over, and probably taught every one of his novels and short stories because I'd been teaching him for so long. It took me 3.5 years to recycle through the entire canon. And now I'm on a Roth purge or a Roth diet.
That was my next question. How do you get that out of your brain?
I'm not reading white males anymore. Jewish white males are absolutely forbidden. I will not read them, as great as they are. I'm only reading women writers for the next 50 years or so, just to get that out of my...
I don't want to say to do penance because we'll get in trouble, but yeah, I get you.
It's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of that. When you get into Roth world, and I'm just noticing this about all the folks who write books about him, usually his friends, you start asking his questions and you start following his paradigms. I refer to this as Rothian path dependency. Like, there are certain questions about his life he keeps asking in this fiction, right? As I pointed out, I don't think he keeps asking these questions and he keeps answering these questions. For example, how terrible was the experience of being married to Margaret Martinson Williams? How awful was it to be excoriated by the Jews at Yeshiva University in the early 1960s? How bad was it dealing with all those feminists? So if you look at how writers who write about Roth, who are invariably all friends of Roth, approach their subject matter, they ask the same questions. And what I wanted to do in this book was ask completely different questions. I didn't want to rely on his approach or his paradigms for understanding Philip Roth. And that's why I think it's kind of a nifty book. It's a creative book in that these are more or less unasked queries about this writer. I'm not saying everything in there is original. It's really hard to do that with this writer. But I was trying to ask very, very different questions about it.
Yeah, what was your history with Roth? And of course, that's a loaded question, given that you and I are contemporaries of Northeastern liberal Jews who, in all likelihood, had Philip Roth and Woody Allen movies from childhood onwards. But I may as well ask your history with Roth's work.
I was in graduate school studying ancient languages and literatures, and I was going crazy. And I told my professor I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to throw up in my mouth, that sort of thing. What should I do to change my thought process? Because I was reading Akkadian documents and cuneiform and Ugaritic and all these. And I was going nuts. And he said, Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, it's the best. I'd never heard of him. I was 20 at the time. I was very young in graduate school, by the way.
Brag, why don't you? Sorry, go on.
No, I was just worried about a fact checker. I mean, I received my doctorate when I was 24. I was worried a fact checker would be graduate school, huh? You were 20. Well, let the record show I was actually 20 in graduate school. So I read Portnoy's Complaint and I laughed. Oh, God. I laughed so hard. The old knee slap, the reading out loud to friends and roommates, right? And the weird thing, Gil, is now I laugh a lot less. And to me, that's the perilous journey of the critic. You study the things you love, and then you love them less because you understand how they're built, or you understand what the ruses are, what the tricks are, what the cliches are, and what the problems are with the work. But I started my Roth journey reading him in about 1985 or 1986. And then I read The Counterlife, and I just loved that novel. I still love that novel. And then by the early 90s, I started teaching him, as I noted earlier, basically every year in some way, shape, or form until the present. I never met him, Gil, which I think is really, really important, because at a certain point in my life, I decided I didn't want to meet him, especially when I started doing scholarly research. I didn't see any reason why I should meet him or get an autograph or wave or anything of that nature. I noticed there was a tendency amongst Roth critics to fetishize the man and love the man and want the man's approbation. And I just didn't want that, right? I wanted to be apart from Roth so as to better understand Roth. And that too has a lot, that also figures in how I approach this book. I wanted what I refer to as critical distance, which is the job, I feel, of the critic and of the scholar.
Mm-hmm. I get you. And I've mentioned on the show ad nauseum that he was my white whale once upon a time, to try to get closer to him, to do a podcast, which I knew was never going to happen. But the only time I got close was about 2 weeks before his death, which somebody hinted to me was pending. Last week, in fact, the guest I had, Robert McCrum, the great literary critic and editor, when I asked him, did you have any don't meet your heroes moments over the course of your career without batting an eyelash? He said, the Philip Roth interview in 2008, single worst experience I've ever had. I'm like, okay, makes me feel better about never getting that close. He said everything was stage managed. Everything had to be submitted in advance. Everything was, quotes had to be approved afterwards. He said, I should have conveyed to the reader how unpleasant this whole experience was.
So, Gil, I mean, let's imagine you had him on your show. Here's one of those unasked questions, right? I kept noticing that he would berate journalists and critics who would pose normal questions to him. You see this in Reading Myself and Others. Then in the aughts, he was downright surly with various interlocutors. And what's important to recognize there is he wasn't surly or truculent with people in his inner circle who were asking him more or less the same questions. Claudia Roth-Pierpoint, for example, would ask him Hermione Lee. They would pose really good questions and he would answer them. So there was some component of Roth's character where an outsider such as yourself was a danger in terms of the questions she or he might ask. And he either avoided them, as he did with you, or if his publicists basically forced him or begged him to work with a journalist, he could be really, really unpleasant with them. And you see him sort of throwing back their question into their faces, right? This is the era of the famous author when an author can do that. It's really rare with young authors that they would do that, right? Because the market is so saturated. The market for fiction is getting smaller and smaller, right? And a lot of these authors are good people that don't want to berate their critics, because the critics are the portal, I feel, to wider acceptance of a writer. Roth, I guess what I'm saying, Gil, is maybe it's a good thing he never came to the show.
Yeah, after that McCrum thing, that was my nail in the coffin. With all things considered, it would have been a disaster. And, it's funny, as you bring up that set of circumstances, I'm struck with two different directions that are equally bizarre for this one. One was Nabokov and his need to have all questions sent in advance. He would type up responses, etc. Never did, live interviews. But the other thing that I find interesting, especially in terms of questions from the inner circle versus, someone you don't know. Do you remember Clark Rockefeller, the man who wasn't there, the guy who kidnaps his daughter during a divorce? The FBI comes in and tells the wife, your husband doesn't exist, right? There is no Clark Rockefeller. He's some guy who's taken on that name, but he's not real. And they end up uncovering this German national who outstayed his visa and, became Clark Rockefeller because he could convince everyone of the most outlandish stories in the world.
So are you implying, Gil, that, and I would completely concur with you, that there were certain fears that Roth had about questions that might come his way?
When we bring up the metafictional side of it. And I actually had a friend who was friends with Rockefeller who got cut off from him mysteriously. Never understood why. And when he found out the secrets years later, he realized he must have said something to me that contradicted something, and he was afraid he was going to get exposed. No. And similarly, Walter Kern knew Clark Rockefeller, didn't pick up on the sociopathic monster at all. And, despite his great character analysis in his novels, etc., felt completely embarrassed when he discovered I was friends with a guy who was completely fake and had me totally hoodwinked. So, yeah, I'm not saying Roth was potentially a killer and false, but the metafictional game. And when you build that framework around yourself like that, I can imagine it's very difficult when somebody comes in with, quote unquote, the facts and wants to, get an idea of who this guy is.
But that's what scholars and critics do, right? And Roth, he really didn't respect the critic's craft.
Yeah.
And that's kind of typical with artists. I think some artists in various fields are much better with that than others, but he wasn't an example of that. What is that story by Thomas Mann, the Wonder Child, about this 8-year-old piano player who comes in a white suit and all of high society comes to watch him perform, and the women are swooning, and in the back there's this guy called the critic who's like, oh, God, this is such treacle. Oh, my God, I can't believe he's doing these cliches. But the thing about the critic is his trousers are soiled, which I think is really funny, right? He's got soiled trousers, right? So I am the soiled, trousered critic. Wow, what a way of describing myself. And I always wanted to be that person vis-a-vis Roth. I didn't want to be his fan. I didn't want to be his friend. I love Roth's fiction, some of it anyhow, right? But I wanted to be an actual critic. And the amount of antagonism that one can accrue from Roth fans for making that move, or from fans of any writer, is formidable. But hey, that's why they pay us the big bucks, right? And that's why we do what we do.
You get to run it with a Philip Roth society, as it were. But I should ask, and much like with Robert McCrum with his book on Shakespeare last week, I know it's a tough question, and potentially a gauche one. Favorite Roth? And your sneaky favorite, like the one that's sort of under the radar, but you secretly adore?
Yeah, great question. So favorite Roth, I'm like a lot of Roth critics. I think Ghostwriter is a beautiful, short, lyrical, imaginative, metafictional masterpiece, especially that third chapter. By the way, in some versions, I discovered this, by the way.
I know. No, I was waiting for you to say it.
That the 3 is missing in chapter 3. In the vintage edition, what year was it? Oh my God, of the Ghostwriter. So he took the 3 out, suggesting that chapter 3, that's the one, Gil, where he has the reverie about Anne Frank, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Wasn't a chapter. It was just some thing. So there's chapter 1, chapter 2, this thing that is ghost edited into the text, right? And chapter 4. All right. So Ghost Rider, I'm not being particularly original there. Everyone loves Ghost Rider, and they should. It's a great novel. If you go to the Library of Congress, you can see the excitement in Roth after a bad decade. I mean, from Portnoy's Complaint in 69 to 1979, he kept swinging and missing, and many feminist critics justifiably were all over him. An old guard of Jewish critics were still nipping at his heels. And then he has this sort of revelation, which is the Ghost Rider. It's also very short. And that was something I wish, the great writers don't like to be edited. Roth really needed at points and editors. Too many of his novels, like Operation Shylock, are just way, way, way too long. Sabbath's Theater. I would say the same thing. Okay, the guilty pleasure, The Anatomy Lesson of 1984. As a person, and I believe, Gil, you're in this sad category with me, as a person who has suffered pain, physical pain and psychic pain, The Anatomy Lesson breaks down pain in ways I've never seen done in just any art form. The way he describes the pain, and then at the very end of the novel, when there's more pain, and I think there's a line that goes, and now he understood what pain really was. And you've been reading about his pain for 250 pages. What's also interesting about The Anatomy Lesson is Roth goes into kind of rant mode. This is 1984. His character pretends to be a pornographer by the name of Milton Apple. This is very, very complicated. But grosso modo, what I find interesting is the way the Nathan Zuckerman imaginary persona called Milton Apple is ranting reminds me very, very much of what Twitter trolls do nowadays. I'm serious. I mean, it's really funny, right? This way of just saying the worst thing on your mind and slugging somebody in the face, right? I can't even repeat some of the things that are said about the Pope and about the Jews and about, I mean, this guy just going off on everyone. Roth, in a way, was innovating a form of rage. He wrote about rage merchants. He let rage merchants rage on the page. And I'd love to see somebody write an article about how he was almost prophetic, right? Because that sort of rage is very similar to this like Fox News diatribe that you'll see on Twitter or on Fox News or elsewhere. And I find that really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And least favorite, which is to say most hated?
Oh, yeah. A great American novel.
Okay, which I haven't read, and I hope never to, even if I do my backwards chronology of Roth.
Well, I wrote a piece in Salon magazine about Roth and race, and that work is just despicably racist. There are all these racist tropes about Africans and African Americans, and it's just I don't know what he was thinking. I'll say something that'll probably end my membership in the Philip Roth Society. I really don't like Sabbath's Theater, and that's everyone's favorite, including Roth. He identifies that as his greatest work of fiction, the work of fiction he tells everyone to read. I've never liked that work on in terms of form and in terms of content. I'm just not a fan of that one, I have to say. So.
My belief, it's not a favorite of mine, but my belief is that it sets the stage for that entire phase of his career. Every novel that comes after Sabbath Theater has tendrils coming from that book. And I'm that's part of my re-exploring this stuff. I'm like, I think every single one holds up, but I'll have to.
You were going to say he got it out of his system, and that was a very rough period in his life when he was writing that. That was after the divorce breakup with Claire Bloom and public ructions, and it's a very dark period where he's sort of mining the most negative components of his character, and he's just going for it. And then I think the American trilogy, which follows, it's almost like he divested himself of all that rage and anger. But let me ask you, I'm very curious, what is your favorite Roth novel?
Well, this will sound, again, nobody's listening, so I may as well say it. And I've mentioned it before on the show. Your origin with Roth is Portnoy's Complaint. So is mine in a sense, because my mother was reading it out loud to my father when I was being conceived. So that's my going far back with Roth is in fact before I was born. So, I guess I have to respect that one for what it is. My sneaky favorite is Everyman, a very late one, but I've returned to that one every couple of years because I'm an old Jew who's going to die. I'm really torn about, I think I would go with the Ghostwriter, right. Or I'm looking at my shelf now, and it's a real toughie. Like the American Pastoral series, I've only done once, all the way through, and feel like I should go back and I will probably gain more out of those. Yeah. But I in all likelihood would go with the Ghostwriter, with Everyman as my sneaky fave. I have to say, having only read it very recently because of my spotty erudition, if I'd read My Life as a Man when I was younger, I'm not sure I would have been as much of a fan of Roth.
Yeah. Though one thing about My Life as a Man, so this is critic versus fan, right? I can definitely understand how the fan could look at that and say, "Oh, what is this? This solipsistic, endless, right, rant." And wow.
And the brutal violence near the very end, the absolutely brutal violence. I'm like, I'm not sure I would have been able to handle this.
And exhuming his dead wife. Oh, he did this 10 times, by the way, as I count in the book. And just bringing her up again for another drubbing, right? However, the critic looks at My Life as a Man and says that is the pivotal work in his career, because I described it as like a testing ground where he exploded all this narrative ordnance, right? And he's just blowing up these narrative bombs. And he's playing with new forms and new ways of telling stories that he had never previously used. Very postmodern, very metafictional. And that, talk about tendrils, those tendrils would remain in his work for the next 3.5 decades. So as difficult a text as My Life as a Man is for a fan, because it's just sort of endless and it's confusing and it's looping. It really shows the path forward to Roth's aesthetic in the coming decade. So it's a great book to go back to after you've read Roth and say, this is where he got it. Okay, this is what he was trying here, but failed to accomplish. I think My Life as a Man is the one I've read the most. I've read some Roth novels up to 10 to 12 times, and I've probably read that one 10, 11, 12 times, given how many times I've had to teach it.
Another sneaky fave that's jumping to mind is Deception, which gets no credit whatsoever, but I remember I've only read it twice back when it came out. So, I may be giving it more credit than it deserves, but it's an interesting one for me.
Sure.
I should go look back at.
Sure. I mean, this is when he gets obsessed with the notebooks and this heavy postmodern notion of recursivity and indeterminacy. You don't know what the text is, right? You don't know what it is that you're reading. That started in My Life as a Man, right? Where you're holding this physical object that says Philip Roth, but you don't quite know what it is. Right? Like why it's there? Who wrote it? Did Nathan Zuckerman write it? Did Philip Roth write it? Who wrote this section? That happens in the Ghostwriter in that 3rd chapter, Missing the 3, where you have no idea what it's doing. I find that kind of cool. And it's fun. It's like, why is it here? And this is where Roth was really playing with form, novelistic form, in ways that really justify our appreciation for him as a great American writer.
Yeah, where did did you find the postmodern influences for him? Those turning points in terms of who he was reading that would have led him to, I should start turning this inside out and,
So there is some scholarship on this. It's kind of a puzzler, right? Because postmodernism politically is very, very left and very opposed to two things that Philip Roth loves: the United States and Israel. So what scholars are trying to figure out is he's like the postmodern arch, this guy, in literature. I mean, he's really a postmodern writer starting in 1974, and he's a popular postmodern writer. I mean, he's selling tens of thousands of copies, writing experimental novels and postmodern novels. But is he reading like Derrida and Foucault and Barthes and Kristeva and like, no,
Yeah.
I don't think he is. There's an allusion in the Counterlife to the Tel Quel crowd made by Maria Zuckerman, and I'm blocking the name of the scholar who's written about Roth and postmodernism. It's a bit of a dilemma for Roth scholars, right? Did he know a lot about it, but he just didn't want to admit it, or did he just happen to independently have very similar thoughts about how literature works? Here's a question that I'd like asked. Did he read any literary criticism of people who were not himself? I mean, literary criticism, not biographies of his friends, right? Did he go into modern fiction and PMLA, right? Proceedings of the Modern Language Association? Did he just read scholarship on fiction? And my guess is no, given how hostile he was to literature professors. He tended to slight them at every possible turn. So I don't know. I don't think he was reading theoretical postmodernism, but he was a postmodernist, and that's what's weird about this writer. Yeah.
And that's what I wonder, whether there were either precursors or, people he was, in that Bloomian sense, people he was, rivalry with, or even, past generation types he was,
he definitely
fighting
read
with.
The French Lieutenant's Woman, right? Which is just a masterpiece, right? So I'm sure he read that and was very, very influenced by all the narrative sleight of hand and postmodern trickery and artifice of that text. Who else he was reading, we'd have to ask some other specialists, right? But whether he was reading literary critics, that I would say no. And that was an intentional oversight on his part. He didn't want to read them because he felt they didn't understand what literature was.
And the devotion to metafiction and the obscuring of the persona, I know that goes way into biography, which we'll get to the next question.
But I don't know where that's a great research project, not one I'm going to conduct because I have years until I read my next Roth novel, right? Or reread a Roth novel. But yeah, I'm wondering, was it French Lieutenant? Where did these postmodern and metafictional, and there's postmodernism, there's metafiction, there's autofiction, there's a lot of overlap between these literary styles. And he clearly was a master of them and very interested in them. But where did he get it from? He's certainly not the first, right? But who is he reading that might have helped him get there? Now, in the current issue of Philip Roth Studies, I did a crazy project in which I looked at every writer cited by Roth within his fiction. Every fiction.
Yeah, you've got that in the book, too. I mean, you just make a reference to it in the book.
Reference to it. They wouldn't publish it because it was like 50 pages, right? But luckily, it's online now. It's open access with Purdue.
Okay.
And people can look at it. The winner was, take a guess. What is the one writer Philip Roth cites more than any other writer, hands down? Take a guess.
Either Kafka or Henry James.
Nope, Shakespeare.
No shit. Okay.
Isn't that wild? By a lot, right? By a long shot, Shakespeare. And then there are all these other writers in there. I'm going to have to draw up the list that you'd be really surprised. You're like, who knew, right? But what I learned making that list is he rarely cited women. I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but luckily it's published so people can go see it. It's only like 12% of the writers he cited were women, and very few African-American writers, which went back to my work on Roth and race. Very few, right?
Yeah, we should talk about that.
Yeah,
that's
we definitely should.
Yeah, it was, I would say, illuminating / despairing for me in your book to really see the numbers, especially because in the back you've got the charts of Roth's work and references to race and things like that in the piece. At what point did you get tell me about your take on Roth and race, and at what point it really was driven home to you how he renders race over the course of his career and his fiction.
Well, thank you again for actually reading the book. Thank you. I really appreciate that you're looking.
It's only 130 pages. Yeah, I mean, the main text, and it's a subject I care about.
It took so long to get it down to 130 pages. I have this thing about brevity, right? I like to pack a lot of information into short spaces. I don't know why. I'm a minimalist, right? All that mid-century modern architecture in my house. Why did I put the table there? If I could just ask a question for you, why is it even there? because I had a friend who I shall not name who was a critical race theorist. And the friend said, unless you quantify it, your critics will say you're insane. So just put it down in a graph so you don't you can get past that step, right? Your critics say, no, it's not true. You're making it ours. So now they can't because that table is there showing all the times that Roth cited African Americans, often pejoratively. All right. So now we have to deal with that body of evidence. What's my theory? My theory is that Philip Roth embodied the classic liberal paradox of the Jewish American towards their African American brothers and sisters, a mixture of condescension and a feeling of brotherhood and alliance at the same time, and sisterhood. Isn't that weird? So I've got another fourth.
I've lived through it. I know exactly where it's coming from. I get it. But.
Right. So I've got another forthcoming book with my colleague Terrence Johnson called Blacks and Jews in America. So I don't feel I'm just whipping this out of nowhere, right? I mean, I don't feel this is something I've studied that parallel bibliography on Blacks and Jews, and Roth falls in, even in terms of the chronology of his life, into a type of American Jewish intellectual who imagined that she or he really was the best friend that African Americans ever had, right? So these were liberal Jewish Americans. But when you scratch the surface a little bit, you found lots of racist assumptions that may have come from their parents, right? And then as the Black-Jewish relationship started to fray, and that started in 1967, though it had been building for decades, quite frankly, as the so-called alliance started to unravel, Jewish American intellectuals started to take aim. And this is why Great American Novel, 1974, is so stunning to me, right? Because he really recklessly takes aim at African Americans in ways that he knows must be very, very insulting. Why? Because the fight was on at this point. It was an all-out brawl between the intellectuals in both of these communities. To Roth's credit, Gil, he sends up or lampoons Jewish racism in Portnoy's Complaint. All right. So while being racist and promulgating racist tropes, he does manage to show you a real problem in the Jewish community of this racist, condescending attitudes towards African American folks, especially the blacks of Newark. So redirect me, because there's so much interesting material.
Well, I mean, there's a side question I'm dying to ask you about also. But I mean, I'll say my wife's family comes from rural Louisiana, or they live in rural Louisiana, and that's been a conversation point between me and her about the overt versus covert racism.
Right.
And, you know, the well-intentioned racism and the basically any form of racism that we have, and how we just find ourselves as white people, Jewish or not, falling into some of those patterns of behavior. My side question, since you studied blacks and Jews in America, in January we had the Senate runoff votes in Georgia.
Right.
Warnock and Ossoff both won, the two Democrats. Ossoff received 20,000 fewer votes than Warnock.
Right.
Same vote count, a total, but Perdue managed to get 20,000 more votes than Loeffler did against Warnock. Right. Perdue did with Ossoff. What dynamic possibly leads to I'll vote for the black man but not for the Jewish man, both Democrats?
That could be. I mean,
I'm fascinated by that since the numbers came out.
Yeah, we'd have to really break down the data there by county, right, to see if those were Southern Gentile whites who were liberals who were voting for Warnock but not Ossoff, or those were African Americans, right, which is what you might be theorizing.
Either way, I have no clue how it breaks down, but that's a very weird split.
It is
to say I'll vote for, because you know if you're voting for a split ticket, then you're handing the Senate to the Republicans,
right.
But you're willing to vote for the black male, but not the white Jewish male.
So there's clearly something going on there. So let's take a theory of, given what you've said, that there is that those were African American voters that would not vote for a white Jewish candidate. Sure, that's possible in terms of the Black-Jewish interaction, as especially in the rank and file, not so much amongst the elites, but in the rank and file, there's a lot of tension. Roth writes about this, right? American Pastoral, where Lou Levov is going off on what the blacks did to Newark, right? Oh, Newark, right? The paradise of the Roth family. How dare the African Americans, right, destroy Newark? How dare they riot? As one scholar pointed out, like Roth shows zero empathy for the fact that Newark from the 30s forward was like a Jim Crow city, essentially. Right? Roth doesn't seem to realize this, right? There's no sympathy for what this community was going through. Instead, he is engaged in offering us this pastoral, and I use the word with intention, this pastoral of his wonderful childhood in the Weequahic section of Newark. Something you said earlier made me think of Harold Cruse and a lot of the literature I read about blacks and Jews. Cruse and other intellectuals of his way of thinking saw white Jewish Americans as even more dangerous than racist Gentiles, because the white Jewish Americans claimed to be allies and friends when they actually weren't. Now, I personally disagree, but that is a sentiment that one encounters in the African American community, in a minority of the community, I would say, that white Jews were troubled because they always claimed alliance, brotherhood, and sisterhood, but they actually weren't. And I feel that anger, you feel Roth reacting to that, to those accusations and that type of anger, especially in his work from 69 to about 84, as he's contemplating Newark. Then he comes back to it in the American trilogy. Then he tries to apologize in The Human Stain, I feel. The Human Stain is the first time that Roth really thought hard about race. I don't think he got it all right, but at least he's using that great Jewish brain of his to think through this problematic in a way that has the dignity of thought. And that's an attempt on his part. Yeah.
And I feel like, especially you have a passage in that same chapter about my sneaky fave, Everyman, and the very end where the Everyman is talking to the black gravedigger who buried his parents and is all likelihood going to bury him also. That one struck me also as I don't want to say apology, but yeah, we'll go with apology. Some sort of, attempt at making up for some of what he has done over the years as a writer.
Yeah,
Roth, but.
I thought that interpretation was like cheeky, like I winked my eye at that one. It drove a lot of my, reviewer number one and reviewer number two went nuts when they wrote it. Like, how dare he say? But in a nutshell, what I was saying was, I think it's interesting that, yeah, just as you said, the unnamed African-American gravedigger has buried all the Jews and will clearly bury the assimilated white Jewish person, the everyman, right? And Roth just, is he trying to bury all of his prose, his unfortunate prose on African-Americans? Is it a mea culpa from Philip Roth? I don't know. I just found it kind of interesting and minor observation.
And that's why I'm a failed literary critic, but it's okay. So this all gets to the question of how that we talked about at the beginning, how students' approach to or appreciation of Roth has changed over the years. What have you seen? And again, the book goes into race and gender, obviously, and sexual relations as conveyed by Roth. Why don't you tell me what do students see now versus what they saw back then, how it's changing, and the bigger question of whether Roth survives another generation or so of readers?
Sure. So when I taught Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint at Brooklyn College in, might have been 95, 96, and we read that final scene, and I'm guilty as well, right? Where Portnoy is with the Sabra Naomi, excuse me, she's not a Sabra, with Naomi, the Israeli, she's an American who has come to Israel and made Aliyah. And at the end, he essentially tries to rape her, though he's playing it for laughs, and she beats him up, right? And the class laughed. They roared. They found it so funny. All right, that's 1995. In 2005, 2 or 3 women in the class said to me, I'm not comfortable with this scene because it depicts a rape. and they were in the minority. And being the good professor, I was like, yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm seeing that myself. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. Right. In 2017, at Georgetown University, when I taught Portnoy's Complaint, there was an insurrection in the classroom. All right. And the students were like, why are we reading this? This dude needs to be canceled. Now, Georgetown students are very sophisticated people. I don't want to make it seem like we had a woke social justice mob. There were some really bright, attentive readers there. And they were outraged by not only that scene, but the scene in The Dying Animal with Consuelo Castillo, and scenes in My Life as a Man where Tarnopol almost beats his wife to death, gleefully, I would add. And sure, so what's happening is not only white males are creating, controlling, and interpreting fiction. We're not only listening to their voices, we're listening to other people, and that's all good. And other folks are saying, wait a second, I've got problems with this. Now, I've had many African-American students that love Roth. I've had more African-American students that are puzzled by the racism. I would say the same thing for women, be they white, African-American, Latina. When they read Roth, lately, maybe 8 out of 10 are perplexed and a little bit upset, but there are always 2 or 3 who think he's a sublime writer. And both things can be true. My fear, thinking about Roth's legacy, and a lot of this book is about the legacy of Philip Roth, is I don't know if we should be buying Roth futures right now. I don't know if there's going to be a market for this type of fiction. And I was asking myself, well, what will be his To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And my answer was Nemesis, because Nemesis, his final novel, avoids a lot of the ideas and themes and literary moves and aspersions that we understand to be quintessentially Roth. It's quintessentially non-Rothian as a novel, right? There's not a lot of sex in it. There's not a lot of...
There's no Jewish mother.
There's no Jewish mother. Well, right.
His mother dies at childbirth. And yeah.
Exactly. So, I don't know. I will admit to this. I've never liked the American winner-take-all approach to the arts. I think there are lots of great artists, and I think Philip Roth was a great artist, which is why I've spent so much of my life studying him. I'm unsettled and uncomfortable with the idea that Roth received so much, that so many prizes went his way, that so much acclaim. There are lots of great writers, as you know. You interview them, right? They're there. And if we're going to have this great American culture, we're going to acknowledge that there's not just a gold medal, bronze medal, and a silver medal, right? There are dozens upon dozens of really, really spectacular fictionalists out there. And Roth got a just lion's share of the attention, and I don't feel great about that, Gil. I feel he got a little too much.
Well, you do have that piece where you were interviewed in The Guardian recently about Roth and self-promotion. And as Spy Magazine, I did once interview Kurt Anderson, so I can make this reference. As Spy Magazine put it, was log rolling in our time, where guys were blurbing each other, recommending each other, etc. Yeah. You know, you go into sort of how disillusioning it was finding those letters in his archives at the Library of Congress.
Yeah, I really liked Spy Magazine, actually.
Yeah.
I read it when I was young, and I was like, yeah, this is what critics do, right? I mean, it wasn't all perfect, but being an academic, I mean, we make a lot of noise about double-blind peer review, right, and full confidentiality, and we never quite get there, but at least we have this ethos, right, of fairness and judiciousness. And what I was seeing in the Roth archive is I was seeing Roth, this is not Roth's fault, right? Roth was doing what any writer does. He was gaming the system, right? He was networking and making friends and back scratching and log rolling, to use that great term from log rolling in our time, right? He was log rolling. It's such a funny image. But it upset me. And of course, there were dozens of tweets saying, boy, what a moron this guy is. What a simpleton. Doesn't he understand I understand how the world works. All right. I understand that. But in Roth's depictions of the writer's lonely, heroic life, right? He keeps writing novels about writers, right? There was never a scene of log roll or back scratch. And that's why I was a little upset. I was like, oh, I didn't get the authentic stuff, right? What I wanted Roth, I wanted him to give me the pure stuff, right? I really wanted to see what it was like to be a writer. And what I learned in the Library of Congress, to be a writer of Roth or Zuckerman's stature, was to almost constantly be greasing the skids with your buddies and making sure that they got that teaching gig and, you got that Fulbright and this one wrote this letter of recommendation. Nothing wrong with that. I didn't find it in the fiction, and I was very, very disappointed. I didn't go off and sob or cry or break down or, go on a 2-week retreat to acquire wisdom. But I was very, very surprised by it because Roth was a hero, right? He was a hero to me when I was younger. And this often happens when you study the artists you love. They become less heroic the more you get to know them, right? And that's a very natural and I think healthy process, actually.
Sure. Was there other disillusioning or even, really compelling stuff you found in the archives that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, all sorts of. There's a very personal letter. I don't know what to do with it. I took a snap of it that he wrote to his therapist about the type of woman he's looking for. And I don't know what the ethics are of this, right? I have it. It's so raw, right? It's almost like he's sobbing as he writes it. He's talking about the type of girl he's after in life, and why can't he just have the... So I don't know what to do with it. I feel it's almost voyeuristic to share it because it's clearly Roth at his most authentic and his most unguarded. And I wouldn't want anybody doing that with my stuff. So I don't know. I know where it is, right? Somebody will have to ask me, and maybe they can conduct the operation of interpreting it. There's some weird stuff in there, Gil, right?
Yeah.
I went with an assistant, and I think we did what nobody else has done. We looked through every single file together. And that's like 36 cartons worth, right? Thousands, tens of thousands of pieces of paper and pictures and memorabilia. There's so much in there. And it gave you a sense of a person that was in constant contact. He was not a Salinger-esque recluse. He wasn't a loner, though he often tried to describe himself as being halfway or partly that sort of thing. He was the life of the party, man. I mean, he just knew so many people. He was constantly writing to people and hanging out with people. God bless him. Why shouldn't he? Right. But a lot of those people were in the industry, obviously, and they were facilitating his meteoric and to a certain degree well-earned rise to the pantheon of American literature. There was some strange stuff with women which might appear in the footnotes of the work. But if anybody were to say, well, Jacques, can you direct me to something that's really kind of hot and new? I would say, take a look at that letter, because I've never seen Roth like that before. He sounds like he's just been lobotomized, right? I mean, he's down on his knees crying about women. And it's very, very different from Mickey Sabbath, and it's very, very different from David Kopesh, and it's very different from Gabe Wallach or Tarnopol or Zuckerman. I've never seen that voice. And that's Roth's voice to his therapist. And that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's what I wonder, given how much artifice there was, how much you could take a look at something and say, that's not constructed. Yeah. That's an honest man in a terrible moment, as opposed to, right. He's trying out something that's going to turn into a piece in a book.
Right. He's not doing a bit or he's not rehearsing, right? He's just crying in this letter. And it's really kind of touching. Another thing, Gil, is with a lot of male writers, they do a lot of macho, like dude talk, right? I'm not going to use the terms, but ways of referring to women that I'm sure everybody would expect Philip Roth actually used, right? There's a lot of it. And you read it. My research assistant was a woman, she was 25 years old. She was 28 years old. And she was just wincing, right? And, the Library of Congress would be like, wait, what's going on? What do you got? What do you got? What do you got? And she would like push the letter across the table. And I'd be like, oh, God, yeah, this is really bad.
You have to understand. And it was a different era. And
I didn't give her that speech, Gil, right? I was like, yeah, we suspected as much, right? Because we saw it in the fiction. Some of it is really, I don't know, like sophomoric And I know where the letters are. I don't want to say who the writers are that are engaged. Some of them are still alive. But yeah, he just seems like another guy, right? And that's something you'd never say about Philip Roth, right? Like nobody ever thought Philip Roth was just another bro. And here he comes across as just another guy, right? Talking about women in really derogatory ways with his buds.
Which I guess gets back to the question, and it's part of the subtitle of the book. You know, when we talk about Roth's survival, you know, as a red writer, you know, it's a thing you bring up throughout, or especially in the later stages of the book. He's not accused of anything. There is no Philip Roth did this or that in front of me without my consent. There's no, you know, Me Too thing, and yet he's, you know, lashed in with that. He's tied in with the Me Too cancel crowd in a certain way that I guess we should ask, do you think it's real? Do you think it's fair to see someone's fiction and kind of extrapolate doing a reverse biography like that?
It's a tribute to the power of his voice, right? Like to this day, we don't have a credible Me Too accusation. Now we're getting very, very close in Claire Bloom's Leaving a Doll's House.
Yeah. I was just about to say Claire Bloom is the exception to the case, but yeah.
There's emotional abuse in particular, right? But in terms of like, there's no Louis C.K. moment. There's certainly not a Bill that we know of, right? So the tribute to Roth, this is a weird tribute, is he captures these male modalities, right? You know, Oedipal complex, impotence, rage, right? And he does such a good job of voicing that I think folks have a hard time drawing the boundary between, right, the fictionalist and the fiction. But here comes Berlinerblau saying, well, actually, right, ... The fictionalist and the fiction aren't that far apart. So I don't know how to get out of this. I'll tell you this much. Some of my brightest students who are feminists, most are women, they're men feminists, have no stomach for the guy, right? There used to be that kind of cool feminist, right? The feminist that was like super sex positive. I remember those in the aughts that liked reading this, right? That was pro-pornography, pro-sex worker, I should say, right? Even those kids are not digging Roth anymore. So I'm a little bit nervous. And what I tried to do in the book was carve out an alternative canon, right? Like books, I call it Roth unsexed, to use a Shakespeare term, right? So what's the unsexed Roth? So you've got Nemesis. To a certain degree, you have Ghostwriter, which I think people can read and really, really enjoy and benefit from all that's you know, luminescent about Philip Milton Roth. Outside of that, it's hard. Then there are ones that people like Plot Against America, which I'm not a huge fan of. Indignation. I really like Olivia Hutton in Indignation. And I like the way she's slut-shamed. And I like the way Roth recognizes that even his central protagonist, Marcus Messner, is a really small man for engaging in the slut-shaming of this woman, that she was a special young woman, right? And all these men are just making her life miserable, right? And Marcus Messner, the central protagonist, the hero, right, was one of them. And I like that about Roth. So I think that might be a novel that people can read in the Me Too moment and say, okay, you know, he was a sensitive person. All his friends, by the way, Gil, right?
Well, that's always he was never sexist around me. And so it's never a good defense to say, you know, this person or that person.
Because I wasn't feeling it as I was going in, right?
I could tell.
Yeah, you know, press the eject button, get out of there. Yeah, I'm just gonna. You're right. I'm wrong.
It is really tough, though. I mean, when you get an Ozick talking about how amazing he is, and you get Vivian Gornick on the other side with there's not a progression here. This is a guy who saw women as, you know, not human, and reflected that in a lot of his work. I'm like, I gotta kind of balance it, and you know. And of course, read it for yourself.
I heard your Gornick interview. You know, kudos to you. That was a great interview. I really, really enjoyed listening to her. And I enjoyed your questions as I'm enjoying them here. But I know Cynthia, right? I've interviewed Cynthia Ozick. And I'm just not down with her on this. There is in Me Too, I'm not the first person to say this, there's a huge generational rift amongst women, right? So let's say my wife is clearly, I mean, she's my age, I'm 55, right? She's clearly pro, right? Hashtag Me Too. But every now and then, her and her friends might express some generational disagreement with younger feminists. And I think what Gornick was saying on your show, if I recall correctly, is, yeah, that's part of the cycle, right? So it takes 50 years, she said. Yeah. So there's this gap, right? There's this cycle whereby older feminists might disagree with younger feminists. And I think what Gornick was saying, but it's all good, right? It's all progress towards the goal. Yeah, there are divisions in Me Too. I think they're not insurmountable. But I do notice that older women who I speak to about Roth read him differently than this younger generation. But the younger generation is the generation that's going to live and is going to consume books and create books and criticize books. And that's where I think Roth's posterity has a problem.
And that gets to the big question, the Blake Bailey biography. And given the metafictional elements throughout Roth's work, is the Blake Bailey scandal the greatest metafictional novel that Roth never wrote? Because, I mean, as an outsider, if you wrote the story of what happened, that would be Exit Ghost to like the 10th power, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
If you had the great writer who finds his biographer after slagging the previous one, dies before the book comes out, and this is what happens as the book is released. I mean, it's like Roth writing. It's like that Borges thing where the encyclopedia infects the world. Like, this is a real life Roth novel, and it's so.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah. I think. I don't want to really comment on. I mean, oh boy!
And we're not going to say anything about the allegations themselves and the what happened to the people involved. Not in any laughing way. I apologize if it comes off as that. But
let me recommend a book for your very literate readership. I was reading essays about this, and one that came up was My Dark Vanessa. And
I've heard of that, but I haven't read it.
Oh, is that good? I really, really enjoyed that. Right. And it just gave you a sort of, from the perspective of a 15-year-old girl who is the victim of this unwanted sexual attention, but sort of goes with it because she's 15 years old. Right. Yeah. It's really, really well done. This is what I'll say. The whole thing is sad. Right. It's just awful reading those stories, and in a very crass materialistic way, it's not good for Roth's legacy. So Laura Marsh nailed it in The New Republic, right? She was the first person, even before, I believe, the allegations.
Yeah, it was before the allegations. Yeah.
I mean, I had been, if you read my footnotes, I'm sort of presaging the fact that this is a very bad arrangement, right? This arrangement that Roth had with his biographers is really unhealthy. It negates what scholars and critics do, right? But I could have never imagined it would have gone to this level. Like, we didn't know that the copyright was shared, right? We hadn't really thought through the implications of burning the archive. As you know, with my colleague Amy Pozorski, we have circulated a sort of not a petition, like a statement saying, do not burn these materials, estate of Philip Roth, right? So Roth world is in disarray now. I should say the Roth estate is in disarray because the hand-selected biographer had this issue around him, and it confirms the suspicions that Roth critics have about Roth, right? They always had these suspicions, right? That he was just the type of guy that would befriend such a person and trust such a person, right? So it's not good for Roth's estate. I think it could be good for Roth studies, which needs a huge kick in the ass, right? And here's the first kick in the ass it needs. We have to stop letting non-Roth scholars set the agenda for this writer. I can think of no American writer whose interpretation is brought to us by so many non-scholars as Philip Roth, right? Roth has many, many fans, and many of his fans work for the most important publications in the country, right? Yeah. I want to restore the integrity of the professional literary critic and or the literary scholar. So that's one thing that should emerge from this. Point number two, we're critics criticize and be damned. All right. We're not fans. And I feel there's a little bit of a tendency, even in the scholarly apparatus around Roth, to be too friendly towards him. And it is starting to change. And there are many exceptions to the rule. But I think we need to take a harder look at Roth, his personal life, even the analysis of the fiction, its merits, right? We have to ask if he was the beneficiary of certain cultural advantages. And I think the answer is absolutely yes on that, Gil. And I just like to see that as the next stage of Rothiana, right? Of official Roth studies. Is it going to happen? I don't know. I really don't know. Fans are fans. I'm a fan of a lot of musicians, and I don't like to hear negative things about them, right? Even though I know that they're probably true. So it's up to Roth fans in a way to let critics do their job and identify a path forward so that his legacy can persevere. And I do think that is something I tried to do in this book. Whether I succeeded or not, I don't know. But I did try to say, hey, we could look at this, and we could look at this, and we could look at this. And maybe this is something that more literate laypersons in the United States might take an interest in, as opposed to the blue material from something like Portnoy's Complaint or Sabbath's Theater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, like I said, for me, I don't even have the book in front of me. I didn't take notes while reading it. I just absorbed every damn thing you were bringing up throughout it, and just thought, oh, this is a conversation that I know I can write down 3 questions for, and we're gonna groove on this, because somebody for whom, like you've studied these books. It's not simply oh yeah, I read that a few years ago. And that understanding of literary reputation, especially as you see it play out in academia, to me, this stuff is absolutely fascinating. And it raises that other question as to whether he was the last one, whether there are, the quote unquote literary lions anymore, or whether that era really is past for a variety of reasons, internet primary among them.
Sure. Great question.
But,
and I hope he's the last one. I do.
Yeah.
There's so many great writers, right? I mean, I have 2 sons who are artists, and I've been watching them in the arts since they were 6 years old. And it's not the case that there's only one great bass player in the local cohort. There are 3. And then when you zoom out to the region, there are 10. And then when you go to the country, right, there are 25 double bass players in jazz, right, who might be 16, 17 years old, who are just fabulous double bass players, right? So I know that music and literature aren't exactly the same thing. I feel in the arts, there's all this talent. And we really do a bad job of recognizing all of it. And what happens when we give these prizes and when we develop these networks and these fan bases, as we did with Roth, right, we get these lions, and that happens to the detriment of other serious writers. And often the process is gendered and raced and classed. And that makes it even more of an imperative for us to overcome this. So I hope the literary lions are done. I mean, you're a reader, I'm a reader. We read lots of books. And I'd like to foster a culture in which there's not a Roth hovering above all the other writers. I'd like to think there are 20, 30, 40 young writers at a time that we're all thinking about. And they're sharing the praise and the fame, right? Yeah. And we all support them. I would hope.
Before I ask what you're reading, let me ask, did it really, the lack of a Nobel, did it really burn Roth's ass as much as is intimated?
Yeah. One of his confidants, I won't mention who it is because he's a controversial person in his own right, said he wasn't a friend of Roth. He had turned into an enemy. And he wrote me an email, and this is a direct quote. He said, ha, ha, ha. The fact that he hasn't gotten the Nobel eats him alive. I'm doing my own Jewish man accent. It eats him alive. So, yes. And do I care? No. All right. These are first world problems or, first world literary guy problems. Absolutely not. So he was very, very upset about that. I don't like prizes, Gil. I've never liked them. I've written a paper about why best teacher awards are bullshit. I think prizes is this uniquely American fetish and fixation, and we should just get rid of that process. There are just so many good people that deserve our.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's there's a great piece. I think New York Magazine did it, just ranking every Best Picture award winner from the time the Oscars began. And you start scrolling through, like, oh my God, these are some of the worst movies.
Yeah.
These are just, things from our memory. It's like but that was the most important thing. We had to know who was going to win and then get mad about it year upon year upon year.
Sociologists do a lot of interesting research on prizes. And I've read so many good academic studies about how it's just this self-fulfilling prophecy, basically. And 98% of the people who win the prize, who don't, most of the people who are eligible for the prize are just automatically eliminated, right? Because it's about this 2%. You should read, if you haven't, Pierre Bourdieu, who writes about cultural capital, right? There's a logic to this, often a hidden logic that people aren't even aware of as they're playing it out.
Yeah, no, it's to me, you find the good books and you pass them along to other people. Well, I mean, we're almost like samizdat in some respects, where we're just trying to keep the culture going. But
you asked me who I was reading. Can I tell you?
Yeah, no, I was just about to say, speaking of that, who have you been reading?
Right now I'm reading Susan Choi's Trust Exercise, which is interesting. I like it. Good writer. But right before that, I had finished the Marlon James canon. And I think Marlon James is, as we would say, and he's a monster. Woo.
I've heard great stuff. I've never read him. So
is he a great writer? So, A Brief History of Seven Killings, the Book of the Night Women, I believe it's called. There's so much talent out there, and there's so much genius, and there's so much creativity, and these writers have it. And God bless them. And it's our job, Gil, as critics and as journalists, right, to let the world know who they are. And there are dozens more. I'm not going to name them all right here, but
because you're going to get pissed off about somebody you forgot. Exactly. So it's better to keep them guessing or keep them hoping.
So let's go with Marlon James for now. What a phenomenal writer he is. Wow.
If you do go back and read a Roth novel, which one would it be?
Probably Anatomy Lesson again. He really did understand pain. Right. He was writing from a place of deep knowledge because he suffered from legitimate and phantom illnesses his entire life. Some were psychosomatic and many were real. And I'm sorry?
I was going to say, when the auction came up for his effects, I, of course, went looking for the standing desk, just to see. And, I figured he either bequeathed it to somebody, or as it turns out, it's in the Philip Roth personal library in Newark. But I was thinking, I don't know how much money I would pony up for that. And I'm not a collector of that sort of thing, but that could be kind of special.
The fact that we know these things about him, do we know these things about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky? I mean, there are things about Roth that are just planted in the bloodstream of the publishing world. And then the stories are told again and again and again. And I just don't think they're that important. Right. The standing desk. Yeah, I remember this. I remember the standing desk. I also remember seeing him on a CBS piece where he was sitting down while he was writing. I was trying, hey, what happened to the standing desk? Right? I was asking myself. So yeah, sure. And the Roth paraphernalia. I have some. I'm looking at a painting that my agent, Michael Moncello, got for me, and over at Inkwell, right? So they got me a Roth painting, and it's the strangest. If you want, I'll tweet out an image of this painting.
Oh, please, yeah.
It's the last
painting by Roth or of Roth?
It's apparently a painting they just found in his house, and it's sitting right here, and I'm looking at it, and it is the last iconic image you would ever associate with Philip Roth. I can't even describe it, right? I'll tweet it to you. And
I can't wait to see this. It's going to be a great thing to also, tease the readers with. I'll give our listeners with. I'll give them a link. Oh my God. So outside of, the contemporary writers you're into, are there, classics you fall back on? Are there great pieces you occasionally find yourself like, let me just go read a dead man for a while?
Yeah, reading a dead man is always fun. I mean, I cycle through, Flaubert and, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, as does everyone. There's nothing particularly original. Chekhov, every time I read Chekhov, I'm like, yeah, that's so good. That's just so good, right? But my specialty is post-World War II. So those are the writers that I'm more familiar with. Also, I was trained in Bible, so I read a lot of ancient literature, which is also quite good. I don't know if it's quite novels. They haven't developed the novel yet. But I find that always to be fun to read the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Or to put on an interpretive lens, a modern interpretive lens, and read, I don't know, the Book of Ruth, and clearly do violence to how the author intended for it to have been read, but I read it as a modern, and I find things in it that I think are very, very beautiful. So, yeah.
I should ask the last question to just really put us on shaky ice for this one, given that we've talked Me Too, Roth, literary survival, and My Dark Vanessa. Does Lolita survive?
Yeah, Lolita survives because if you read My Dark Vanessa, for example, it's intertexting just pervasively with Lolita, right? Lolita is like a source book, an encyclopedia of ideas and tropes and themes to explore about this very sickening form of attraction, right? So Nabokov nailed it there, right? There's a lot there for people to kind of chew on and think about. So I think Lolita lives because even the victims read it. I'm not saying they enjoy it, but they read it and they recognize something that is fascinating or true or interesting there, right? So that might be one criteria we apply to Roth, right? Will that happen? Will people recognize fascinating, true, and interesting women in his writing? My initial thought is no, just judging from some of the women that I've taught and how they read him now over the last 5 years or so. But maybe people will find ideas there that, regardless of whether they agree with them or not, they find them worthy of deeper scrutiny and deeper engagement. Yeah, that might happen, but I wouldn't hold my breath. But Lolita lives without a doubt.
Cool. I say we reconnect in a couple of years and see where Roth studies are, where Roth readership is, and we get you back on the show.
Thank you. Quick question: are you related to the master?
No, outside of the fact that my conception is tied to his quote unquote seminal work, as I always like to call it. No, I'm not actually related at all. But again, that was going to be my angle. If I ever got close enough, I could have played the Portnoy's complaint thing and hoped that got me in. Although there's probably a huge cohort of men who have that exact same story. About,
in the Library of Congress, I met a guy called Philip Roth, right? I read a letter by a guy called Philip Roth who wrote Philip. It's really funny, right? Like, hey, Philip Roth, right? And and Operation Shylock, of course. We had another.
Yeah, of course. Well, that years ago when I was interviewing Thane Rosenbaum in New York, he was one of the people I asked, you have any in with Roth? And he said, no, I bumped into him once on the Upper West Side, but he denied it was him. And then Operation Shylock came out like a year later, and I realized he was probably playing with me, but it was so clearly Philip Roth. There was no way this couldn't be him. And he just, no, I'm not, I'd never heard of him before. So, yeah. Metafiction upon metafiction.
That was life.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jacques.
Gil, thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for reading the book and taking the time to ask these great questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And that was Jacques Berlinerblau. Go check out his new book, The Philip Roth We Don't Know, Sex, Race, and Autobiography, from University of Virginia Press. If you're a Roth reader, you will find it illuminating and an intelligent approach to reading the fiction and seeing what the themes are that you may have been missing over the more obvious ones that are there. I don't know why I offered up Deception as a fave. I haven't read it in like 25 years, although I did pick it up again after our conversation. I'll let you know what comes of that. But you can check out Jacques' work at his website, jberlinerblau.com, which is the letter J, Berlinerblau. He's also on Twitter as Berlinerblau. I'll put links to all that in the show and episode notes, along with the picture of the painting from Philip Roth's home, which Jacques emailed me after we wrapped, and which I cannot begin to describe nor do justice to. You will have to see that in the show notes webpage for this one. Now, there is plenty to check out on Jacques' site, including his books, articles, interviews, CV, courses, a much more extensive bio than the one I provided at the top, and more. He's, besides the Philip Roth stuff, he's done a lot in his career, has a lot going on, got a book coming out next year he co-authored on blacks and Jews. So I'm hoping we get together to talk about that next year, because, well, there's an awful lot he's done that I'd love to get into. We just really focus on the Philip Roth stuff this time around. Now, you can support this podcast by telling other people about it. Just let them know there is this guy who puts out these really neat conversations with people every week, and that they should give it a listen. You can also support it by writing me and telling me what you like, don't like about the show, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie, TV show, book, music, comic, piece of art, piece of theater, whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by email, postcard, letter, or you can leave me a message at my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail. There is no, I don't pick up, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me, and you can leave a message up to 3 minutes long. Also, let me know if it's cool to use your message in an upcoming episode. I may do that at some point. Now, as far as support goes, if you have money to spare, I hope you'll use it to support individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo. There's people who need support for artistic or creative projects. There's people who need help with medical bills. There's a lot of need out there that I hope you guys can help fill. As far as institutions or foundations go, if you're not comfortable giving to individuals, you can look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds, especially in terms of voter registration and things like that. There is a lot we can do to help build a better world, so I hope you'll help. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.